All right, everybody, welcome back to Imaginary Lines. This is the amazing eighth episode of our little creative Zoom cast conversation. We had talked a couple of episodes back about Christian art and kind of being critical of sort of how bad Christian art can be, and unfortunately, a lot of times usually is, and why that is. But I think, Darrell, you'd said you wanted to circle back around to this topic again, and maybe in this case, talk about those situations, those examples where Christian art is actually really great, and why it's great, and let's talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I remember when we were first talking about Piss Christ and Christian art. I mentioned Thomas Kincaid, and then you had said the painter of Trite, and then for a minute I thought to myself, he paints pictures of cow stomachs. I should take a closer look. But then I remember, but I guess my hearing wasn't too good. You said Trite, not Tripe. But
Right, Trite.
so if there is a painter of Tripe, that'd be kind of interesting.
Yeah, there should be a painter of tripe. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, I've actually eaten a lot of goat stomach, but not cow stomach, it turns out.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of any of the stomachs food. I like food. I don't want to eat food. I don't want my food to be in my stomach that is actually somebody else's stomach or some other animal, animals, creatures' stomachs.
Actually, I remember when I was in Rwanda, one nice thing there is they always have like street meat where there's just rows and rows of people with grills where like you can just pay a little money and get grilled whatever just as you're walking around. And the whole time I was there, I kept having what they called zingalo, which was really tasty. And then when my vacation was over, I found out it was grilled goat stomach.
Mm,
And because it's all like fat, it was really tasty.
yeah.
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 So, yeah. So that was kind of cool. So basically, we talked about why Christian art is bad. And maybe that wasn't fair because it seems to me like in the 21st century, everything's bad. All art is bad. And
All art, but a lot of it might be.
yeah.
So why do you think that is? You think it's because it's commercialized? It's more about like you have to create art. I mean, this is my theory. I think a lot of art today is art where the artist feels the need to create something that can be monetized. Like I need to be able to make money and sell this. Whereas, I mean, not that Van Gogh and other guys weren't trying to sell their paintings, but I think now there's more of a market and you're trying to hit a market that is not necessarily very deep. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting problem that we have where greed has like it's funny, like greed is a sin, but in previous ages, not even that long ago, greed was considered uncouth. Where if you read if you look at art from the 1930s, in a Charlie Chaplin movie, the rich guy is not the guy to admire. The rich guy is always the scumbag, the moron, and the butt of the jokes. And I was just reading a Dick Tracy story from 1933 where Dick Tracy saw the case and was offered a reward. And he immediately just laughed and turned it down and said, "More money, more problems."
I'm sure he didn't say exactly that, but something like that.
Pretty close. And like up until about 5 minutes ago, like even in pop culture, the rich guy was not the guy you aspired to be, but he was like the caricatured villain and the butt of the joke. So that's something kind of new. And
right.
And the other part of your question there kind of ties back to when you were talking about idea space, where when science fiction writers talk about steam engine time, that's kind of their way of demythicizing the process and saying the reasons all these science fiction guys had the same idea at the same time is because they were all receiving the same sort of cultural signals.
Right.
So art has to be made like culture comes first. Like,
Right.
you know, if Mozart's dad hadn't given him piano lessons, he wouldn't have been Mozart. And like Albrecht Dürer's dad was a goldsmith. And so back then you did what your dad did. So he should have been a goldsmith. And his dad just happened to see he had some talents. So he said, okay, you don't have to follow in your father's footsteps, which was insane because that's what everybody did. And William Shakespeare, his dad did not know how to write. And that's quite the anomaly, right? That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But generally, the culture has to come first. And I think this current culture is lacking in a few things where there's a reason we haven't made a masterpiece in a long time, and it's kind of a drag. But in terms of Christian art is pretty great. And it's hard not to notice that for the past 2,000 years approximately, the best art is all Christian art.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not a Christian, that's quite the coincidence.
Yeah.
Certainly, like in any art you pick, whether it's music or painting or literature, the best thing you have there, whether it's Rembrandt or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Bach or whoever, is based around Christian themes, and
yeah,
it's pretty hard not to wonder why that is.
Yeah.
And,
now part of that is, I think, that there was a long season in history where the church was the patron of the arts. So we had these great artists, whether they were composing symphonies or painters or sculptors, where the church would commission them to do something and pay them a whole lot of money to do something. And so they were given freedom and time to create, to use their artistic abilities. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we have such a rich history of Christian art being so phenomenal, is because there was a time when the church was interested in that kind of a thing and financially supported the arts. Whereas I think today, it seems to me anyway, that the church today in some ways has taken an opposition to the arts. Like it's not as open as it was, or if it is open to art, it's really only open to a certain kind of art, which again is serving some sort of like a Christian subculture, where it's interested in creating art for Christians. Like, let's create music that only Christians would listen to. Let's create, like Thomas Kincaid, let's create, these kind of paintings that mostly Christian soccer moms are going to want to hang in their living rooms, whatever. And so to me, I think that's part of it too, is the church's posture and attitude towards the arts has changed from what it used to be.
Well, it's kind of funny when you say the church today. I kind of blank out there, where I'm thinking I don't know what that really means in 2021, because like certainly in Canada, like when people want to talk about big questions, they don't really call on the church, whatever. It's kind of a really marginal little, cottage industry thing. But about what you were saying about the church having like artists that they had as that they gave patronage to, not to back things up too much, but the writer Tom Holland, who's not even much of a Christian himself, he's written a lot about Christianity's influence in the world, and how he says a lot of things we think are axiomatic and obvious are actually really contingent, and things like the dignity of the person. He says that's actually a really Christian idea, and before Christianity, human rights was like Martian rights. It just wasn't something on the table.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that people think of as being Enlightenment ideas that are actually not, and they're actually Christian ideas.
Right.
And I really do think in good art, you ask these big questions that Christianity sort of sets the table for.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's funny because Rene Girard makes a similar point as well about that, about how prior to Christ, it wasn't considered normal for people to like sort of root for the underdog or to root for the, to show concern for those that were suffering or that were oppressed. It was, and so it's now become, because of Christ, it's become something where we as a society tend to try to look at things from the perspective of the little guy or the person that might become the scapegoat. We are now capable of putting ourselves in the shoes of those people, whereas really prior to Christ, that was not a normal thing. And that's actually something that Christianity has created, a sort of a shift in the way we think, the way society behaves, even if you're not a Christian, right? It's had this influence on culture.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point. And like, you notice how there were no anti-poverty protesters in the Republican Rome in
Right.
100 BC.
That's right. Right.
Right. You know, no one was protesting social injustice during the reign of Augustus.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the thing about giving voice to the victims there, before Jesus, basically Virgil wrote the Aeneid when Jesus was probably a baby, approximately, and it's great art. And basically, it's very much about a founding myth of Rome,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't give a voice to the victims. Basically, I won because I'm awesome. Suck it up. Get used to it.
Right.
And the victims don't get a voice because take a look around.
Right.
Life is tough. So what?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's really revolutionary. And again, that's something people think is so just baked in. They don't get how bizarre it is based on most of human history.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, like the idea that slavery could be wrong.
Right.
Right.
No, see, that's a great point. I mean, I think people are really critical of like, well, why doesn't the Bible condemn slavery? It's like, well, we live in a post-slavery world where my mindset, where like we automatically see that as such an evil thing. But I think, so it's really easy for us to say, well, why didn't, this is so obviously immoral. Why didn't everybody get it? Well, because everybody lived in a world where it was just part of life. This is just the way things were. There was no one, it would be, I can't even think of an analogy. It would be, I can't even think of a good analogy. It's like, it was seen as something so normal that for anybody to stand up and sort of protest, like you said, against slavery, let's end slavery. They're like, what's wrong with you? Like, this is the way the world turns, right? This is the way everybody has something to do and feeds their family. And, I mean, yeah, it wouldn't even have occurred to them to even stop and think about that. There were many other things on their minds. So I think, again, in a world now, that's been influenced by Christ, because of that, actually, we can say, because of the influence of Jesus, because we have a voice now for those that are being oppressed, that's how it's possible to reach a place where, societies and cultures could be self-reflective on that process and say, this really isn't a good thing. Maybe we should end this. I think the only thing that would be similar today, maybe, would be something like the idea of war, going to war or something like that. I think that's the next big sort of cultural shift that we need to have as humanity, to just now take a step and look at the whole idea of going to war and say, this is a really stupid idea. Why don't we stop doing this? Right. Because it's, again, that's another one of those things where, well, it's just what you do. Right. This is how we solve problems. And we, after hundreds or thousands of years, you'd think we would have been able to objectively take a step back and look at this whole thing about, let's look at this problem solving efficiency of war. How does it really solve problems? Wow, actually, no, it's a pretty stupid idea. And we haven't solved that problem either. We're still working on that one.
See, and what you said there about how the Bible has a default bias in favor of the underdog and in favor of the poor, and that kind of explains why Christianity doesn't work in America. Because basically, since approximately 1945, whatever you want to pick, things in America have been pretty good, like abnormally so. So the fact is, the Bible isn't for people like that.
Right.
And, it's like Robert Alter is good at talking about how subversive the Bible is, about how God rewards lying in the Bible. And like, there's no story in the Bible where Jacob comes off as a good guy, but God likes him. And like, well, what's that about? It's like, well, he doesn't have an army. He doesn't have strength. All he has is that wheeling and dealing thing. And he's trying to survive because there was no social safety net. It was like a lot more, close to the bone, right? Yes. And it's funny about the way the Bible talks about slavery and how they have all those laws about slavery. There's actually a bit in Deuteronomy where Moses is going on and on and on. And he actually says something like, if you do these things, you will have no poverty among you, right? And it's like, but I know you're not going to listen, so here we go.
Right.
Right? So he's actually hinting that if you actually got with the program, you wouldn't have an underclass. Like, right. You really wouldn't want that. Like, you'd work at that. But you're not there, so instead you're going to get the law and blah, 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 right? And that's pretty interesting. And it's kind of like how, in The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, people have had this debate for a long time about, is this flamingly racist or is it super anti-racist?
Right.
Right. And, Shakespeare was smarter than we are. And it's actually very interesting how subversive he is, because before Shakespeare came along, there were plays and they were pretty stinky. And they had a lot of stereotypes. And one stereotype they liked was the Jew with the huge nose, and like a huge nose, like taped on and all that stuff.
Right.
And that was like a cultural cliche they had, like we said before, like the guy with the red shirt in Star Trek. We all have that association. We all know that, right?
Right.
So Shakespeare had to have the Jewish guy with the big bird nose to sell tickets. Right. That was just kind of baked in by the fact that he existed in a certain place at a certain time. But then to actually give this guy a speech where he says, if you prick us, do we not bleed? Is my blood not the same color as yours? All that kind of stuff. Yeah. That's actually really new and really wild. So there he's actually playing within the base cliches of the time to actually subvert them.
Yeah.
And that's pretty interesting, right?
Yeah.
And, so on the one hand, sure, it's a racist stereotype, welcome to Earth. But for the first time, he's actually taking this thing and giving this person life and making the people think like, oh, wow, maybe Jews are human beings,
Yeah.
And so this whole thing about, that's one thing the Bible is really good at, is giving the hint of an interior life to minor quote unquote characters. There's many times in like the Bible when they insist on giving a voice to people from outside of the tribe, or when the important character in a story is like not of the chosen people.
Right.
And it's like, well, hey, wait a minute, I thought life was simple, us versus them.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and that is the interesting thing too. But you also see the Bible reflecting human nature in the sense of like, when the story of the Jewish people begins, they are slaves in Egypt, and then then God redeems them. God is a God who cares about slaves. He's a God who listens to the suffering of the slaves. And wow, this is a different God. This is a God that isn't the God of the powerful and the conquerors. This is a God that listens to the cries of slaves and responds and rescues slaves. Wow, what an amazing God. And then fast forward a few chapters, and now all of a sudden those slaves' children have grown into becoming a great, powerful nation, and they want to build a temple to that God. And guess what it says? They use slaves to build that temple. And it's like, hello, what happened?
Yeah.
Like, did you not remember? Right. And that's human nature. That's what we do. We forget a little bit.
Yeah, that is pretty wild. Yeah. And it's kind of funny when people criticize the Bible and they say, well, LOL, the Bible condones genocide and slavery, blah, slam dunk, right? And first off, what can be more boring, right?
Mhm.
And also when these people point out the dark bits in the Bible, first off, it's like, do you think you're the first person to ever notice that? Plus, it's like, oh, I'm sorry. Would you prefer I lied to you?
Right. Let's just pretend. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to that point as well, it's one thing to say, well, those people in the Bible, they condoned genocide and slavery, as if we've solved those problems. Like, do we not have slavery today? And again, we've talked about this before. Like, if you have an iPhone, technically you condone slavery, because without slavery, you wouldn't have an iPhone.
100%.
Yeah.
Steve Jobs was quite honest about his love of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon workers have to pee in a plastic bag.
Right.
Right.
Oh, listen, even like what's going on right now, so China is persecuting the Uyghurs, right? This is the Muslim sort of sect of Muslims in China. And one of the things they've done is create these massive work camps where Uyghurs are doing slave labor. And guess what they're doing? They're building iPhones, and we're working on Nike shoes and Coca-Cola bottling plants and crap like that. And what's funny is that when the United States government wanted to have a blanket statement, condemning the use of slave labor, the American corporations that opposed that were Nike and Apple and Coca-Cola, and like, hello. Why do you think why would any corporation stand against, something that would say we don't like slave labor unless they're using slave labor? So, I mean, yeah, we definitely have these problems today. It's a little more hidden, and it's a little more subtle. And I think our attitude is kind of like similar. What's funny is our attitude is similar to the attitude that people had way back then, which was like, well, what am I going to do? I can't change this. It's the way the world works. I'm just going to have a Coke and a smile and play on my iPhone and wear my Nikes and, go jogging, because it's just the way things are.
Yeah. We are pretty bad, I must say. Sure.
We're supposed to be talking about Christian art somehow.
Yeah. It just, like, this is kind of what I thought people go to art for, to be challenged and to be forced to do a hard reassessment. But it turns out, no, people don't want that. They want the Fast and the Furious, right?
Right.
But like, seriously, like, if someone reads the Bible and says, oh, wow, they oppressed women, had polygamy, and had slaves, therefore I'll be an atheist. I just feel like saying, you weren't tall enough for this ride. And like, have you looked out the window lately?
Right.
The CEO of Nestle just said that access to water isn't a human right.
Right.
Because he wants to sell you the water.
Uh-huh.
But so basically, Christian art. I started noticing that all the best art is Christian art, and I thought, well, why would that be the case? And it turns out Christian art sort of gives you the foundation to. And I think because of the incarnation, gives you the springboard intellectually to assert the dignity of every piece of matter, every clump of dirt, every person. And that's when you really start things rolling.
Hmm.
And then I had this idea: if Christian art is so good, what if the obverse is true? And it started seeming to me that I had this idea that all good art is Christian art, even if it doesn't know it is.
Hmm.
In the sense that good art correctly diagnoses the problem and the solution. And
Right.
there are certain yearnings that are universal. Like, remember one time I saw the movie Bad Lieutenant with Harvey Keitel. I'm not sure
Hmm.
if you've seen it.
A long time ago.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, I saw this and I thought this is a Christian movie, right?
Yeah.
And of course, it's famous for just being full of like, shocking depravity stuff. And it's one of these movies like The Joker where it's great, but everything rests on the power of the central performance.
Right.
And like if you had anybody else but Joaquin Phoenix and The Joker, it'd like be nothing,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
And the funny thing is with the movie Bad Lieutenant, um, they were they were starting to actually film the movie. They had everything in play, and Christopher Walken was the star. And the director had made a movie previously with Christopher Walken called the King of New York.
Yeah.
And then just before they started shooting, Christopher Walken said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this. I'm not the right guy," and
Right.
left when they had like built the sets and everything. So then they sent it to Harvey Keitel, and then Harvey Keitel said, did, he didn't really like it, but he said, "When does someone ask me to star in a movie? Never. I've got to find something here." So they rewrote it a lot and went to town on it. And the Catholic League of Decency condemned it as immoral pornography. And the joke is that the director of the movie went to mass and took communion every single day.
Right.
And basically, in this movie, there's a guy who wants to solve a mystery involving a nun. The nun says, "I've forgiven them, just let it go." And then eventually, in his cracked out kind of way, he tries to have a redemption moment or something. And if you squint, it's like, wow, the brushstrokes are pretty broad, but it's a Christian story,
Yeah.
written by a guy who went to mass every day of his life. I mean,
Yeah.
directed by, he wasn't the writer so much. And
Yeah.
it's just really nice about how good art can show you what's universal to all.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's been a lot of films like that. I think I like your comment about um, how good art is Christian art, even if it doesn't intend to be. And I think there's a lot of things like Piss Christ is an example of that. We talked about that, right? I don't think that artist was a Christian, but I think he inadvertently communicated something really profound. And I think lots of movies I've seen that are that way too, where maybe I think this is what I love about it is that you really can't always tell, did they intend it to be this way, or is it just sort of it just worked out this way? But it doesn't matter. The point is that the film or the work of art, whatever the song, I've listened to music, I've read books where there's this very strong redemptive theme or this really beautiful truth that's like a thread running through it, and whether intentional or not, I think you could say this was a great Christian message or great Christian theme. So like I would similarly say a film like Gran Torino is another one. Clint
Okay.
Eastwood. I don't know if you've seen that one.
Yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the same kind of thing where, he's cussing all the time and he's kind of a racist and he's this kind of crotchety old man, get off my lawn kind of a thing. But he slowly befriends his neighbors who are Hmong's. And even though he's very racist against Asian people, and he becomes a protector of them. And then, spoiler alert, he sort of becomes a Christ figure who lays down his life for these people, which, in the beginning of the film, he hates Asian people because he was in the war and kind of sees them as the enemy. And he calls them gooks and all this stuff. But they love him so much and they embrace him so much and wear him down a little bit that he really loves them. He genuinely sees them as human beings and he loves them enough to lay down his life for them. And I love the film for that message. And like I would put that in the category also of a film that, whether intentional or not, has a very strong and very beautiful redemptive theme, and a kind of a Christ figure, someone who's willing to lay down his life for an enemy who has become a friend.
That's pretty cool. That kind of made me think. Liam Neeson had a movie called The Gray, which I'm not sure
Yes,
if you've seen.
I love that movie. Yes. You didn't like that movie?
I think I think it's pretty awesome. Like, I think that's a real Christian movie, right? And basically, of course, when you have a movie that is that intensely man against nature, it you have a chance to get close to Jack London territory, where
Yes.
like Jack London had this story called To Build a Fire, and it's so great, and it's a real high point in American literature. And sometimes when the conflict is that stark and that urgent, it actually does have this like mythological shadow haunting the whole proceedings. And basically, in that movie, The Gray, he actually says "F faith," where
I forgot about that. That's right.
yeah, and that's the big turning point in the movie when he says "F faith," where actually he's had a rough go of it in life,
to put it mildly.
yeah, and the struggles he's having with the elements is sort of a struggle you could say he's having with God or whatever.
Oh yeah.
Or to get somewhere and get somewhere real. It's kind of like in Heart of Darkness when you grow up and realize, oh wow, Kurtz and Marlowe are the same person, and the journey up the river is about looking in the mirror and being able to face the dark parts of yourself.
Yeah.
So I thought The Gray was really powerful in terms of that whole plane was full of people who were running away from things that got bad, trying to avoid things, and of course, they know something's missing.
Yeah, I agree. I love that film, and I thought it's funny because I'd forgotten that part of the film. But you're right, because I think his Liam Neeson's character, his wife had died of cancer, and he was basically angry at God, and he had gone up to Alaska, like you said, to sort of escape everything. And his job is and this is I think the film was even loosely based on a true story. So there's people I think they're oil riggers, right? Oil drillers in Alaska.
Yeah.
And but because they're out in the wild, there's like wolves, and his job is to he's a sniper, and he basically kills wolves before they can attack the drillers. And that's the kind of the setup. And then their plane crashes in the middle of nowhere in the tundra, and one by one they're being picked off by these wolves. And it's he's working out his whole thing about being angry with God, and yet somehow the whole thing turns back around. Yeah, it's really powerful. I want to see that movie again. I hadn't thought about it in a while, but I really like that movie.
Yeah, and again, that's the power of art there, where all that exposition you had just said there, if you actually lay that out in a movie, all the oxygen would be sucked out of the room
Right.
and be horrible, right?
Right.
But in a movie, if you show this guy who's chosen to go to Alaska to shoot wolves for a paycheck, and he's not in the best of moods, and then you just show this Polaroid of a woman, all you need to know. You can say, and like all that stuff you just said with words is just bang, and like people get it,
Yeah.
And so that's really great. And we'll have issues with loss, right? And that movie just really dialed up, right? And that's really great. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
So
I was going to say real quick, somebody else quickly that who I think makes really great Christian films, most people would never think of as a Christian filmmaker, is Martin Scorsese. And he's also someone who is a Catholic, and he goes to communion, and I think he has a real rich faith in God. But he sometimes makes films that people look at and would not call Christian, because they're violent and they're bloody, and there's sexual things in it. They're like, whoa, this seems really extreme, right? This is a rated R film. But even if he's making that kind of a movie, there's always a redemptive element to it. And he's always pointing out something in his films, whether it's overtly, a Christian theme, like something like Silence, which I thought was a phenomenal great movie. And that movie is about faith and doubt and things like that. And it's a great movie. But even his other films, like I said, that kind of don't necessarily come across that way. Raging Bull is an example. Or just other films that he's done. If you go back and look through his catalog, I think he makes really good films that you could probably categorize as Christian films.
I actually wasn't the biggest fan of the movie, the Silence. I liked the book. The book was fine, and I liked other books by that novelist, but I didn't like the movie.
Why not? What didn't work for you?
I just didn't get if he was saying that the Christians did surrender at the end or not. And in the book, that part was just kind of played differently, where I wasn't sure if like the Christians, if he was saying the Christians did all sell out at the end. But just the way he left it with the ending kind of left a bad taste in my mouth.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. So since I didn't read the book, I guess I didn't have anything to compare it to. I guess there's a couple of levels I liked. I liked on one level that he kind of does point out historically how the whole missionary movement was actually a covert way for, let's say, France or Spain or England to establish some political power in third world nations. And so it was, sometimes the missionaries themselves don't pick up on that. They think, oh no, we're just here to spread the gospel, right? And what they don't realize, another film that does a great job of that is a film called The Mission, where that same kind of thing is on full display. To the guy on the ground who loves Jesus, who just wants to bring Christ to these savages, it's all about Jesus. But then suddenly you realize, oh no, this is a political thing, man. And it's all about political power and our nation establishing dominance and a foothold in this other country because we want their gold or their resources or whatever. And so Silence points that out. And I think I also like how it points out the way that they go about the whole missionary thing is because you hear it from the Japanese character when he's talking to one of the priests, and he says, there was a priest who came here before you and tried to preach the gospel. He never bothered to learn about our culture. He never bothered to learn the language. So this Japanese guy was a translator for him because he couldn't be bothered to learn their language or understand their culture. He just was there to give you their culture and their message, and he didn't care about that. And how that backfired, right? So there's also the point about how, near the end, Liam Neeson's character, who's the one who sort of turned now, says to the priest who's there to sort of quote unquote rescue him, he says to him, because we didn't understand this culture, because we didn't even take the time to really learn their language first, the gospel we've been preaching to them is not the one we intended, because now they think we're talking about the son, not the son, the child of God, right? And so from the beginning, like they don't even get, they're dying for something that if you understood what they understood, you'd say, oh no, don't die for that. That's not even the gospel. But again, we've not taken the opportunity to first come and listen, right? We're here to first listen and learn. We're going to learn from you, learn your language, learn your culture, understand who you are, get to know you first, in sort of a humility to say, we have something to learn from you. And then and only then might we attempt to try to sort of say, well, here's how we understand, faith or God or whatever. And see, to me, that's kind of what happens in the ending, because now these two priests who have sort of turned, right? Well, have they really? Because now they have Japanese wives and Japanese children, and they speak the language. And now that they're really ingrained and in part of the Japanese culture, they sort of subversively and quietly are able to have their faith influence people around them in very normal, kind of organic ways. That's one of the things I took out of the film.
Okay.
And I thought was pretty interesting. And I also get it is ambiguous a little bit about, did he betray Christ by putting his foot down, or did he do something that Christ would have done, which was to die to himself in such a way to let everything about himself sort of be crucified so that these people could live and not suffer. Like in some ways, in some odd, strange way, that priest was emulating Christ more than he thought he was initially when he did that, right? So I think that was a fascinating thing too in that film. I think there's layers to that film that I really loved.
Yeah. The author, Shusaku Endo, was one of Graham Greene's favorite novelists. And the novel had a really nice, terse style to it. And in the novel, one of the big literary payoffs was how he kept hearing this noise over and over again. What's that noise? What's that noise? And then finally, like dozens of pages later, he finds out that noise, which he couldn't figure out what it was the moaning of these tortured people.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a really cool book. And he had another book called Scandal, which was about a guy who was wrongfully accused of a scandal and had to fight these wrongful allegations. But at the same time, he had a guilty conscience about something else. And last time I tried to write a novel, it ended up being just a ripoff of this book, actually, where the guy was like, no, I'm not guilty of being a phony for the reason you think,
Right.
And like he had this other thing, and like that was just great, right?
Yeah.
And so Shusaku Endo was really revered in Japan and was one of their great novelists. And at the same time, the Japanese people kind of viewed his Christianity as like a gimmick or an anomaly because there weren't any Christians in Japan, and he was like the only one.
Mm-hmm.
And so people wondered if he had just done that as a literary pose or something.
Yeah.
And he was kind of curious. And he actually wondered, why am I the only Christian in Japan?
Mm-hmm.
And he had this idea. He thought it was because in Japan, the way he was raised, fathers are really reserved and very distant. And you could grow up and not see your father very often. So because of that, the Japanese people of his generation couldn't imagine a loving heavenly father.
Right. Yeah, because exactly. And see, that's what I'm saying. That's what I loved about the film. I think it points that out. Like if you don't take the time to understand the culture that you're speaking to, you end up sending these wrong or mixed messages, and it kind of gets messed up.
Yeah. So that's pretty interesting. And it's funny when it comes to Martin Scorsese. Maybe I'm not the biggest fan, but in terms of Christian art, I guess you know who Paul Schrader is?
Yes.
Okay. That's pretty wild. Like basically, Martin Scorsese is just really lucky he met Paul Schrader. Let's put it that way.
Right. This is the guy that wrote Taxi Driver.
He wrote Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Bring Out the Dead.
Yeah.
Basically, and Paul Schrader has a brand new movie out with Oscar Isaacs called The Card Counter.
Yeah, my youngest son just watched that and said it was pretty interesting. He has another one called First Reformed. I really enjoyed First Reformed. I thought that was really good.
Yeah. So in terms of Christian art, it's kind of funny. Like, check out this. What if I said to you, there was a guy who didn't read a book until he was 17, and then when he was 25, wrote the great American novel? Okay. How likely is that? Okay. Not too likely, right? Yeah. So basically, Paul Schrader was raised in this kind of frightening, you might say, Calvinist community in Michigan, where they said, where they were really into like tulip and total depravity. And they said, if you see a movie, you'll go to hell. So then when he was 17, he snuck into a theater and saw a movie for the first time. And it was something like Judy Garland musical or something totally innocuous. But because of his background, it was like, just like, the most wild, sensory overload thing, right?
It was like almost like going this like seeing pornography or something, right? Like, oh,
Very much so. Yeah, yeah.
I've seen the
Like, yeah,
unseeable. I shouldn't have done this. What have I done?
yeah. Like he had really crossed over and totally broke with his like tribe.
Yeah.
So then he sees his first movie at 17, and then he and his brother wrote the screenplay for a movie called The Yakuza with Robert Mitchum, which at the time sold for $300,000, which was the most anyone had ever paid for a screenplay.
Mm.
And then he wrote Taxi Driver when he was living in his car when he was 25.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he saw his first movie at 17, and then when he was 25, he was lonely, living in his car, and wrote Taxi Driver in 5 days.
Wow. Yeah.
And then after Taxi Driver, he had enough clout to become a director himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he made a movie called Hardcore with George C. Scott.
Oh yes. Yep. Yep.
Where George C. Scott is Calvinist, and there was one time during the making of the movie Hardcore when George C. Scott said he was going to walk off the set and just abandon the movie and like leave in the middle, and he said, "I'll stick around to the end on one condition: if you promise me you never ever make another movie."
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So I guess he broke that promise.
Yeah. And then Paul Schrader made a movie called Blue Collar, which is one of the greatest movies ever.
I don't think I'm not familiar with that film. I've never seen it.
Okay, one of the best movies ever. It has the best cast ever. It stars Richard Pryor, Yaphet Kotto, and Harvey Keitel. And each of the three was told they were the star.
I love it.
So the hatred they feel for each other is real. And it's basically about blue collar workers in Michigan getting screwed by the man, screwed by the union. And it is great. It is smart, suspenseful. It is and it's scary. And Yaphet Kotto was awesome.
Yeah, I like him.
And it's just great. And then after Hardcore, he did Raging Bull. And in the late 90s, he had a movie called Affliction with James Coburn and Nick Nolte, which is really, really, really good. And it's about an alcoholic monster of a dad who has two sons who react to their horrible childhood in different ways. And basically, Nick Nolte becomes like an alcoholic douchebag like his dad. Right. And then Willem Dafoe's character moves away to the city to become someone else. And he sort of narrates the story. And then at the end of the story, he kind of has this voiceover where he says, Nick Nolte kind of dropped the ball there and blew his brains out or whatever, but don't worry about me, I'm fine. And you're just watching this going, sure you are, buddy.
Right. Yeah, everything's fine.
It's like we said before about fathers, right?
Yeah.
So certainly today, Paul Schrader isn't a Christian, and he wouldn't, but, you can't escape where you come from. Mm-hmm. And I would say he might not be the best filmmaker in the world, but it might be the most interesting.
Oh yeah, and I have you seen First Reformed?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I really like that film. I think the ending is what throws everybody off, but it's actually very similar. If you've seen Taxi Driver, I would actually compare it to Taxi Driver, because the very end of Taxi Driver has that sort of moment of like, wait, what? And then the credits are rolling, and you're like, wait, what just happened? Yeah. First Reformed does that, but probably a lot more of a what. But there's so many great scenes in that film. There's actually a moment, I have to call this out because this is an opportunity to talk about one of my favorite directors who was a Christian. It was Andrei Tarkovsky. And Schrader in First Reformed has a scene. There's a scene in the film that is it's just a flat out Tarkovsky. You can call it an homage or you can call it a ripoff, but when that scene happens in the movie, I think most people, especially if you're not familiar with Tarkovsky's films, it's the scene in First Reformed that it's a normal movie up to that point, but then all of a sudden there's this scene that sort of literally defies gravity, and you're kind of going, what the hell? But as a Tarkovsky fan, when that scene happened, honestly, for me, that's when I fell in love with this movie. And I was like, okay, I think I know what he's doing here. I think I know where he's going. Um, Tarkovsky was somebody who, it's funny because he was a Soviet, he was a Russian filmmaker. All of his film, well, not all of them. I'd say probably the first 4 films he made were bankrolled by the Soviet Union. And um, but he was somebody who had faith, and but of course was working for a government that was very anti-faith. And so one of the ways he would get around it by making, like he made Stalker, which was a science fiction film. But that whole film is, the science fiction elements are really a smokescreen for an opportunity to talk about faith and doubt. And that's, to me, talk about what I would call a great Christian film that has phenomenal things to say and show about faith and doubt. Stalker is awesome. He also made, I think this was his first major production film, was a film called Andrei Rublev.
Yeah, that's great.
Which is a great Russian, painter, icon painter. And the film is a story of his life. And so this is sort of his covert way of like, I'm going to make a movie about my faith and about Christian faith, but I'm going to get away with it because I'm going to make it as if I'm making a film about a great Russian painter who so, the Russian government, the Soviet government was all about like, hey, yeah, let's make a propaganda film about how great Russian artists are the best artists and have the greatest. So, that's how he pitched it. That's how it comes across. But of course, when you're watching it and you're telling this guy's story, you see him wrestling with his faith. You see him talking about, there's a beautiful scene in that film, in Andrei Rublev, where Andrei Rublev, after seeing all this war and bloodshed, makes a comment about how he can no longer paint these sort of idyllic pictures of Christ where he's clean and holy and lifted above, right? That it doesn't resonate with the true Christ, that he sees Christ as one who is the broken and the bleeding, and he's in solidarity with the suffering and all that. And it's just a beautiful moment in the life of this real person. I mean, a guy who really lived. And so I love Tarkovsky. I think he makes great films. Almost all of them are good. I would say I wasn't a fan of his very last one, The Sacrifice, but his other films I think are really great.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, like the gravity-defying moment in First Reformed actually wasn't my favorite bit, and there were bits early in there when it seemed to me he was really doing homages to some Ingmar Bergman movies like Winter Light, where the idea about the priest goes to a church even though he knows there isn't going to be any parishioners, and even though he knows his faith isn't exactly on fire, but he keeps going there and lighting the candle anyway. And
Right.
I really liked all those lonely bits, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was really great. I mean, I thought it was just it was also a wonderful snapshot, I guess, of somebody who is questioning his faith, but is in a place where he's not supposed to. And he wants to, I think it's not even just that he's questioning his faith. I think he's just questioning the way faith has been packaged, right? Because you see him pushing against, like he's not that he doesn't want to be a priest. He's okay with that. He's okay with his faith. He's just frustrated that from the pulpit or from this position, he's not allowed. We talked about this before, how art should be a prophetic voice. So he wants to be a true prophetic voice. He feels like that he as a priest should call out the injustices that are going on in the world, how people are suffering, how the environment is being destroyed, and how he's being told to shut up about that. And that's what's really killing him, I think, right? That's his frustration and his tension, that he's not allowed to do that. And that's kind of what sort of unravels the guy. But I loved it. I think there's many layers to that film. I think a lot of people watched it just straightforward. And then when they got to the ending is like this big, like I said, this big, like, what happened? And then it's over. And you're like, I don't even know what I just watched.
Yeah. Well, it's funny about how it relates to Taxi Driver. Where do you know how the final scene in Taxi Driver is the camera shows you these newspaper clippings of Travis Bickle being hailed as a hero
Right.
for saving the day, and he gets all the acclaim and approval that he'd wanted,
Yeah.
right? And that's pretty creepy and off, because now you know that in our modern world, when people shoot up schools, oftentimes they're doing it to get their name in the paper because they
Yeah.
don't feel like the world has recognized them and all that nonsense, right?
Yeah.
So that last scene's like, wow, this feels so off, right? But then there are some people who say that last scene is just a dream.
Well, I think, see, yeah, because actually I thought the very final scene is he's back in his taxi cab and he lets somebody out. I think he lets somebody out of the cab. He's having a conversation and they're kind of building him up and he lets them out, if I'm remembering correctly. And he's in you think an empty cab and he's driving, but he looks in the rearview mirror and for a second he sees the girl, right? The one he was in love with. And then, but he's even shocked, like, what? And he turns and looks and then it's over. They're like, well, what the hell just happened? Was she there? Or was a lot of this in his head, like a dream? Because after all this stuff, like you said, he's in the newspapers, he's held as a hero, but he's still a taxi driver. Like, he's still just driving a cab.
Yeah, and after the movie you've just seen, the camera panning across that bulletin board of all those newspaper clippings cut out, saying, yay, Travis Bickle, you're like, what? That feels so off, right?
Right.
And both Scorsese and Schrader have left open the possibility that it was just a dream.
Right.
So related to that, there are some people who say in First Reformed, he drinks the Drano, and the gravity-defying thing you see is just his near-death experience as he's dying.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that is that's how I understood it. Like everything that happens after he drinks this poison, you think, because after he drinks this poison, all these beautiful things happen. And you're like, that seems kind of convenient, but you just drank poison, dude. That's no happy ending.
You know, but again, that's very Dante and Beatrice, right? Where Dante had a bad life and died of malaria, and he had really got to the point where he thought death was a gateway to this beautiful ride.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a little bit, I think the ending of First Reformed is a little bit bleak, but it's almost sort of like, this is the best happy ending I could possibly give you based on this situation, right? So it's sort of like, that's why it's kind of this happy ending, but with an asterisk or with a kind of an off note, kind of like, ning, and then you're left with, I don't know if this was so great or not. Was this really a good ending or not? Because all these things are still unresolved, really, for this guy.
Well, I thought it worked because, like, the movie isn't like Shield versus Hydra. It has a very different tone. So, so you weren't expecting like him to like, and like save the flying aircraft carrier thing or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty well done, and it really was kind of satisfying in the sense that Paul Schrader has had these obsessions for half a century, and First Reformed was kind of a summing up. And you know, he's always said that his favorite film is Pickpocket by Robert Bresson, and basically Robert Bresson is the best sort of filmmaker who was able to capture moments of spiritual transcendence, like he made The Diary of a Country Priest, and basically movies are really good at getting you excited and stuff, but they're not really good at conveying spiritual truths and spiritual moments of transcendence. But Ozu and Bresson are really good at that. And when he saw Pickpocket, that's the movie that really changed his life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really great movie. And there's always echoes of Pickpocket in his movies. You know, lonely people searching, you know.
Yeah. And I don't know if I've seen that or not. I want to look that up and see, because there was a film that I saw years ago, and it may be Pickpocket and maybe not. I don't know. I just remember this was like in the 70s, and I think I was watching this on TV. So this film was probably made in the 60s. But it was a film about pickpockets, and I just remember the detail about it because it was like they brought somebody on who was brand new, and they were sort of training them, and they were teaching you the tricks of like how to be a pickpocket. Here's what you do. And I just really I remember that's the part that stood out to me, was sort of the pickpocket giving away the secrets. It's like a magician giving you his secrets, right?
Yeah.
Here's how we do this. And there's like 6 or 7 different methods, right? Like sometimes it takes 2 people and one person distracts him. And other times if you're by yourself, first you want to kind of like tickle them or scare them a little bit, like have somebody kind of scary come up to them. And then reflexively, what they'll do is put their hand on their wallet. So now you know where their wallet is, if it's in their breast or their back pocket. And now that you know that, now the next person who comes knows where to get it, right? I don't know if it's that movie or not. Maybe it has nothing to do with that. But that film, whatever that film was, I just thought was really fascinating because it kind of was showing you the mechanics of how that worked.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it. And they had this whole bit where the camera is close up on the hands.
Yes.
And unlike in American movies, there isn't an orchestra playing in the background. So it just feels a lot more real and strange.
Yeah, it feels almost like a documentary. It feels like you're watching them actually pick somebody's pocket in the train station.
Yeah, and if you get the DVD, it has like an introduction by Paul Schrader talking about pickpocket.
Oh wow!
And it's better than going to film school, where you'll really get a lot of mileage about Paul Schrader talking about pickpocket. It's really worth it.
Yeah, no, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Well, this has been great, man. I always love our conversations, and I think this has been great. I know we're probably going to come back to this again because I think this is such a huge topic about art and what makes art good or what makes art Christian, and things like that. So this has been great. I always take notes when we talk, partly because I want to put the notes, underneath the video. But also, most of these are like books or films that I end up going back and watching because we've talked about them. So you always give me things to talk about and to go back and look at again. So if nothing else, hopefully people listening feel the same way. Like, I got to watch that movie. I got to check out that book.
Well, definitely everyone should read Shusaku Endo, and everyone should see Blue Collar and Pickpocket, big time.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are our picks for the week.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Darrell.
Okay, great.
All right. Take care.
Yeah.